Welcome, everyone, to a webinar entitled Faith That Makes You Think, presented by Dr. Gerard Verschuuren and Dr. Stacy Trasancos. My name is Sebastian Mahfood, and I'm the director of iTest. The Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, iTest, is an association of theologians, scientists, and others committed to a Catholic worldview in which faith and science collaborate in exploring the truth. iTest explores truth theologically in the wisdom traditions of the human community and in the data studied in the sciences. iTest's mission is to foster and disseminate the Catholic position that science and faith are complementary paths to human fulfillment. Before I introduce our presenter, Sister Carla May Streeter, a Dominican sister and professor emerita at Aquinas Institute of Theology, will lead us in prayer. Sister Carla May.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. As we gather this morning, let's make sure that we're open to hear what the Spirit wants us to hear. So I'm going to ask for a moment of quiet. Most Holy One, you have made us in your image as creatures who think and choose. Breathe your Spirit here among us that we and our speakers today can share the wisdom you want us to hear, and that we listen, are open to hear how our faith and our reason can partner in our search for truth, the truth that is yourself. We ask this in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Sister Carla May. And now I'm delighted to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Gerard Verschuuren. Dr. Gerard is a human biologist specialized in human genetics. He also earned a doctorate in the philosophy of science. He studied and worked at universities in Europe and the United States. Currently, Dr. Verschuuren is semi-retired and writes extensively on issues at the interface of science and faith, faith and reason. He does so from a Catholic perspective. Dr. Verschuuren, take it away.
Thank you, Sebastian. You knew more about me than I realized. Thank you for all the information. I'm going to use a presentation, so I will share my screen so that everyone can see what I'm talking about. This is my starting screen. It's about the book, Faith That Makes You Think. I must say, the title, Faith That Makes You Think, is a daring title for a book about religious faith. Many will say, when you think about faith, you may find out there is nothing to think about. They call faith an illusion. That's the kind of people they are. Wishful thinking at best. They consider it a childish delusion, or think of the title of Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. So, are we in trouble? I don't think so. Blaise Pascal, the famous French philosopher, once said there are three kinds of people. Those who have sought God and found him. I hope you belong to them. Those who are seeking and have not yet found, if you belong to them, keep seeking. And finally, those who never seek nor find. That last group is called atheism. Atheism is nowadays a very popular way of thinking. Unfortunately, there is, first of all, the atheism of pagans. They are not really anti-God, they just don't think about God. They don't believe there is such a thing as a God, because we have lost the fourth dimension in our lives. They have lost their senses for the invisible, and what you can't hear and what you can't see. Pope Benedict XVI called that a bad kind of atheism, because they don't even think about God. God is not part of their life. Most people think that agnosticism is a form of atheism. I discussed that in my book extensively. I call them undecided atheists. They say, I cannot prove that God exists, and I can't prove either that God does not exist. It sounds very clean-shaven, but I consider it a real serious kind of atheism. Each time someone tells me I'm an agnostic, they think, oh, yay, please, please, don't think it's so harmless, for it isn't harmless. So I explain more in the book, and I don't want to bother you today with it. It's for the future. Then there is empiricism. People who say we can only believe what we can see, what we can test, what is empirical. I consider them narrow-minded atheists, for there are definitely more ways of thinking about things than what we can see and test and hear and what we can prove that way. Then there is the scientism. If there is a word that you have never heard of before, it is of scientists or people in general who believe that science has all the answers to all our questions. And unfortunately, many people have been brainwashed that day, probably in college, even in high school, on radio, TV, the media. They all say science is the only way we can know things. Well, isn't love more than a chemical reaction? Isn't happiness more than a release of chemicals? Isn't guilt more than an activity of neurotransmitters? Isn't grief more than a cascade of stress hormones? Isn't God more than all there is in the universe? I would say so. Scientism will say no. Science has all the answers for all our questions. If you want to know more about it, read the book that we are talking about. Then there is anti-theism. Those are the militant atheists. They have been very active. It started in England, and it spread like wildfire to the United States. And people say theism is dangerous. If you go with it, our society is going to suffer. Do you believe it? I don't think so. But let's leave them alone for a moment. And then there is Satanism. That is probably the kind of atheism that we found in the Nazi period, that we found in the former Soviet Union, and that we still find in China with the Communist Party. They are enslaved atheists. For my thesis is that they are enslaved. They have sold their soul to Satan. Even Hitler was definitely an enslaved atheist. And one of his friends, Dietrich Eckart, trained him and initiated him into occult religion, which is basically a rite by which higher centers are opened to demonic powers. The famous Cardinal of Poland once said, isn't it strange that the Communist Party keeps mentioning God, but not because they believe in him, but because they want you not to believe in him. So somehow they acknowledge that there is a God, but they are fighting him through Satan. That's all I'm going to say about atheism. I think it's something we don't want to deal with. We want to go against it. So when I say faith that makes you think, please think about these forms of atheism and show through your thinking that you don't believe they are true. So what is our main issue today? The soul has two parts. Do we have a soul? I know it is not measurable, you cannot really see it, but there has to be a soul. We always say body and soul. Most Catholics say that. So there must be a soul. But is that all we can say about it? unfortunately, in philosophy, some have said that the soul is just a ghost in the machine of the body. The famous Gilbert Ryle, a British philosopher, used to say that. And then he used his famous example. If you go to Oxford University in England, and I show you all the buildings there, please don't ask me at the end, and where is the university? So Ryle says that university is just in your head. We only have buildings here. I would say to Gilbert Ryle, well, if there were no university, then those buildings would not even exist. Thanks to the university, those buildings exist. So somehow the university has to exist. I say in a similar way, the soul has to exist. For without the soul, we are basically a soulless machine, a ghost in the machine, correct, but not a ghost. It is a real reality. And the Catholic philosophy, especially St. Thomas Aquinas and many others, say there is a soul. And what does the soul consist of? Two parts, the mind and the will. The mind is the intellectual part of the soul, and the will is the voluntary part of the soul. Of course, they are very important in our life. Without an intellect, we cannot really think. And without a will, we cannot really make decisions. So what does the mind entail? The intellectual part of the soul? It gives us rationality. And thanks to rationality, we have thoughts. That's why faith can make you think. And the will makes sure that we have morality, that we can make decisions, good and bad decisions. So that is what we are going to talk about. But many people will probably say, isn't the mind the same as the brain? In other words, is it not just a body part? Do we really need a non-bodily part like the mind? I have 5 reasons why the mind is not the brain. Let's discuss them briefly, for it's an important point. If the mind were the same as the brain, then we have a mindless brain. The famous German philosopher Leibniz said, if you could walk around in your brain, you would observe all kinds of physical activity, but never anything like a thought. Brain scans can never reveal your thoughts. Thoughts come from the mind and not from the brain. The brain waves are material. They can be small or long, short, or heavy. They can be measured and quantified. But thoughts in the mind are immaterial. They can be true or false, right or wrong, but never small or large, heavy or light. They are unquantifiable. So apparently there is a difference between the mind and the brain. The brain is material, the mind is immaterial. If a certain functional magnetic resonance image activity pops up, that can be associated with certain mental phenomena. But correlation does not automatically equal causation. As we know, we learned that already in high school. This correlation is not automatically causation. Neural activity is sufficient for mental activity, but it may not be the cause of mental activity, but just reflected. So the mind is not the brain. I keep repeating it. This is the 4th reason why it cannot be true. The same thought can be transported by different vehicles. Brainwaves, for instance, or a binary code like in computer science, or a Morse code, and there are many other ways. Go to a library and you will find all kinds of thoughts transported by books. In short, the medium is not the message. The medium can be anything. It's like the news on the radio or in the newspaper. Is the radio the origin of the news? No, it just transports the news. Is the newspaper the origin? No, it just transports or tells you the news. So then we go into the fifth reason why the mind is not the brain, and that is probably the most abstract one, but so important I think that I want you to know it. The brain cannot study itself. As little as DNA could ever discover itself. That would be a real miracle. That would be magic. The brain cannot study itself. You need a mind to study the brain. When studying the human brain as an object of science, a scientist needs a human mind as the subject of science. To explain the mind in terms of physics, atoms, for instance, or biology, neurons, that obscures the fact that one would need to have a mind first before one could even have physics, chemistry, or biology. So without the knowing mind, we could not have known objects like atoms, neurons, and the like. Whew, that was heavy. I hope you are still with me. So now we go to the mind as the source of our thoughts. Thoughts are not a secretion of the brain. That's what Charles Darwin wrote and thought. Sorry, Darwin, if that were true, then your thoughts are only a secretion of the brain too. So not worth anything. I would not spend my money on your thoughts and would not buy books from you, for they are only secretions of the brain, according to your own verdict. Thoughts are not neurons firing in the brain. That is always a very popular argument of Steve Barr. He always says, if you say that thoughts are neurons firing in the brain, then that thought is also a neuron firing in the brain, which undermines that claim. Let's realize it, please. Thoughts have no mass, they have no size, no color. That's why if you could walk through your brain, you could never find thoughts. You would find all kinds of neurotransmitters and electrical charges, etc., but you will never find thoughts. They are not large or small, light or heavy, hard or soft, but they are true or false, right or wrong, clear or unclear. A very weird world. They can be true or false, but there is no true or false in a network of neurons. So let's get to our main issue. We are talking about religious faith. Are thoughts also part of religious faith? You bet. Without those thoughts, we wouldn't really have any faith. Saint Augustine said already in the 400s, believers are also thinkers. In believing they think, and in thinking they believe. Oh, Saint Augustine, I always love your thoughts on that issue. It's great. Believers are also thinkers. And later on, Pope John Paul II would say, all people are philosophers. In a nutshell, they are philosophers. St. Augustine always says, believe so you may understand. If you know Latin, I put that there, but skip it if you don't. And also, and inseparably, he says, understand so you can believe. Phew. St. Anselm would say the same. different terms. I believe so I may understand, and faith seeking understanding. I always like to tell about the father of a girl who came to college, and he was told that they would learn how to seek understanding and believe so they would understand. And he was upset. He said, faith is not to be understood. He said, faith, you have to just leave to faith. Well, the Catholic Church had news for him. He said, you have to believe so you may understand. And you need faith, seeking understanding. It is an old dogma in the Catholic Church. It started already in the 1st century, and later on Pope Leo XIII wrote an encyclical on that issue. He said there is a harmony of faith and reason. And many of you probably think, didn't Pope John Paul also write an encyclical, Faith and Reason? Oh yes. So I think that is just in a nutshell why thoughts are parts of faith too. So what is the role of reason for faith? What is the role of thinking for faith? St. Thomas Aquinas again, my favorite philosopher. Reason prepares the mind for faith. Without reason, you could probably not get ready for faith. Can God install faith in you? Of course he can. God is beyond all our powers. But reason can prepare the mind. And I hope in my book, Faith Makes You Reason, that you are prepared for faith. It also explains the truths of faith. That's what most theologians have been trying to do. How can you prove that God is a triune God? How can you explain that God became incarnate in his Son, Jesus Christ? And how can you explain that Jesus was resurrected? And finally, reason defends the truths of faith. That latter part has become known as apologetics. If you have ever heard that word, that means you are trying to defend the truths of reasons against atheists, against people who are not prepared yet for faith, or for people who want to explain the truths of faith. I think those are the most important parts we have in our faith. There is much more to it, of course. That's why you need a book like that. So, again, the soul has an intellectual part, the mind, and a voluntary part, the will. But there is a conflict sometimes between those two. And that is worded very well by St. Thomas Aquinas. He said, whereas unbelief is in the intellect, the mind, the cause of the unbelief is usually in the will. You don't want to believe what your intellect tells you. And I think you can talk for years to atheists, and you can try and you can come up with the best thoughts and the best arguments. If they are not willing to accept what the intellect tells them, there is no hope. And that's the kind of atheism I talked about at the beginning. Many of those atheists still hold on to that belief. They don't have the will to accept what their intellect shows them. I maintain that we can prove that God exists. Can you prove that to an atheist? Of course, if they follow your starting point, your axiomas or whatever you want to call them, they have to accept the conclusion. Why don't they do that? Because the cause of unbelief is in the will. They are not willing to do that. So I think that gives you a lot to think, I hope. And we will talk about it later in the question or answer, but we go to the second presenter today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Verschuuren, for your excellent presentation. And now I'm pleased to introduce our second presenter, Dr. Stacy Trasancos. Dr. Trasancos has a PhD in chemistry from Penn State University and worked as a senior research chemist for DuPont before converting to Catholicism. She left her career to raise her children. In those years, she earned an MA in dogmatic theology while keeping a large family together, and published 5 books on the integration of science and theology. Dr. Trasancos teaches online science and theology courses for Seton Hall University and Holy Apostles College and Seminary. He is a fellow of the Word on Fire Institute and frequently appears on Catholic radio, podcast, and television. Welcome, Dr. Trasancos. Take it away.
Good morning, and thank you, Dr. Verschuuren, for sharing with us your extensive expertise on the reasonableness of faith. I love hearing you break it down like that. I find it very enriching, especially as we are in this Advent season, about halfway through it. And I wanted just to tag along at the end of his talk to give just a little bit of something that's very dear to me, something that I actually struggled with, and I think I found my way through it. And I think it's very appropriate right now because we are in Advent. It's a time of preparation, a time of thinking about Mary, and this word that is applied to her is one of her 10 heroic virtues, the virtue of blind obedience. So I'm going to share my screen. I first heard this word, and if we were in a room, I could ask you to raise your hand, and probably many of you would have heard of this before, the way of total consecration to Mary. I went through these exercises probably about 10 years ago with my kids with me. We all went to church and made the consecration. They came with me. I had just gone through a series of 5 miscarriages, so it was my way of giving everything to Christ through Mary. And I did the exercises faithfully, but I was totally stumped on this one virtue called the virtue of blind obedience. You can see the other virtues here. They are what you would expect Mary to have: deep humility, lively faith. Blind obedience was the one I stumbled on: unceasing prayer, constant self-denial, surpassing purity, ardent love, heroic patience. Very important for parents, angelic kindness, and heavenly wisdom. And I thought those are all things I can aspire to practice myself. But blind obedience, I wasn't quite sure what that meant. And so, I went to the catechism, and there are several parts of the catechism that talk about what Dr. Gerard was talking about the reasonableness of faith, and how the church doesn't ask us to ignore our intellect. The church asks us to use our intellect to grant to the truths of faith, to reason about the faith and try to understand what God revealed. And here is one such of those passages: human virtues are firm attitudes, stable dispositions, habitual perfections of intellect and will that govern our actions, order our passions, and guide our conduct according to reason and faith. So I was having trouble understanding how blind obedience fits into this. And it caused me to think about what faith really means. And Aquinas talks about this a lot in the Summa Theologia. But based on Hebrews 1:11, faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen. And to a chemist, I have heard Dr. Sheehan say this before, to a scientist, we're not used to, we don't make conclusions without empirical evidence. Like, that's a foreign way of thinking to us. And realizing that faith is the substance of things unseen got me to let go of empirical evidence and start thinking more about what that means. So here's where I came out. I turned to Joseph Pieper. He's a German theologian. He wrote a lot of books. He wrote one on leisure that I'm studying right now, but my favorite 2 are his ones on the virtues. He has one on faith, hope, and love, and that's where I found what I'm about to present in faith, and one on the cardinal virtues. So I love both of those books. But as we know, epistemologically, belief is different from knowledge. To believe means that you're willing to accept this testimony of someone else as true. And the example I like to use, I read on Facebook one time, there was this story about a parrot that saved a 2-year-old's life. And I'm not much of an animal person. Like, we have dogs that I tolerate because my family loves dogs and they're all dog people. But cats, I probably should not talk about God's creatures the way I talk about cats. But I'm not a fan of cats. And we, other animals, I'm just not accustomed to living with them. So I'm thinking of this parrot. How is it that a parrot is going to save a toddler? And the story, it was really, I think it was in the New York Times. There was a mother with a parrot. The parrot can talk. The parrot can say words. They've trained the parrot to say words. The mother puts the 2-year-old in a high chair, strapped in, and puts a Pop-Tart on her tray. It was a girl. And the mother goes into the bathroom to get ready for the day, leaving the 2-year-old with the tray and the Pop-Tart. And you may think that's horrible. You shouldn't do that. But I've left 2-year-olds with Pop-Tarts before. They're not really, at 2-year-olds, you're not too worried about them choking and Pop-Tarts. Well, anyway, the 2-year-old did start to choke on the Pop-Tart. And the parrot was in there, and the parrot goes, mama, baby, mama, baby. The parrot started saying 2 words that he had been trained to say. And he kept saying it so insistently that the mother came running to see what was the matter, and the toddler was choking. And if the parrot hadn't made such a fuss like that, the mom says she wouldn't have come in to save the toddler. So belief applies to situations like this. If we hear a story like that on Facebook or the New York Times or wherever, and we say, we have to decide, do we believe that story? Do we believe that that could happen with a parrot? Do we believe that the mother is telling the truth? Do we believe the reporter is telling the truth? Are these people who are credible, who we can accept their testimony? Knowledge would be if I were in the room with the baby and the parrot. Knowledge would be if I saw it with my own eyes. If I was standing there and I saw it happen, I could say, I know this happened. And ever since I read these distinctions, I'm very careful to say what I know and what I believe. But if I saw it with my own eyes, I could say, I know this happened. If I didn't see it with my own eyes, all I can say is I either believe it or I don't believe it. We also, of course, use the word belief to mean opinion, like I believe those tacos at that restaurant taste good, in lighter ways. But what we're after here is, what is true belief? Belief in Christ. What does that mean? So belief and knowledge are both two forms of assenting to the truth of something. Belief lacks familiarity. It's the very thing that is required for knowledge is familiarity, being able to observe it with our own senses. So they're different. And you learn that in epistemology class, but it's not something, if you're a convert, like for me, that's not something I ever heard before I became Catholic. Well, then there's that saying in Catholicism that faith is certain. And so I was like, no, it's not. Faith can't be more certain than knowledge. If you see something with your own eyes, isn't that the most certain? Well, no. Because, and this is how Pieper explained it, you can know and not know something. I can say, I don't really know differential calculus today, but I'm taking a class in it, and in 3 months, I think I'll have a better handle on it. I could say, I don't really know how to speak French today, but I could go learn it. I could look at, read, assimilate, take things into my mind, grant intellectual assent, and I could come to know things. That's my granddaughter. And so we can reasonably say that. But if it's about belief, if I say, well, I believe that reporter about the parrot today, but tomorrow I'm not going to believe her. If you say that willingly, if you say, I believe it today, but tomorrow I'm not going to believe it, or I don't believe it today, but I might decide to believe it tomorrow. If you're just choosing to believe from one day to the next, Pieper says that's not belief at all. You never really believed the thing in the first place. So that's the certainty that we're talking about. And is faith reasonable? Just to dovetail with what Dr. Verschuuren was saying, faith is reasonable then if we believe in God. So that seems very obvious. But if we're willing to believe the testimony of someone, I mean, if my husband says, I'm going to love you until death do us part, and I'm going to be by your side as his wife, I have to decide, do I accept that testimony? Do I accept what he's saying? And I do. You know, that's the reasonableness of marriage. You can't go through marriage always saying, I'm not sure if I believe you. I'm not sure if you're really going to do that. You have to make a decision, the will. And Pieper makes the point that what we believe in the Catholic faith is not something. If we just said, yes, I believe in the church's teaching on contraception, I believe the church's teaching on, the dignity of human life from conception to natural death. I believe the church is right when it says we're obligated to go to mass. If we just believe in things, that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about belief in someone specifically. And if you believe in God, that is most reasonable. He gives two conditions. Having children, I've got a toddler running around right now as a granddaughter. We get the next generation coming through the house now. It's kind of like the belief in a child. It is kind of childish. Blind obedience that Mary had, and the obedience comes after you have the faith, is kind of childish. If I tell my 2-year-old granddaughter, don't run out into the street, she hasn't lived long enough and acquired enough knowledge to know what happens if a car hits something. She doesn't have that experience, but she listens to me. She does. Some of my kids didn't. I had some kids that if I said don't run into the street, that's exactly what they would do, because they weren't gonna believe something unless they tried it. They had to know. But it's reasonable for a child to trust a parent. The parent has more knowledge. The parent is above them. They're incomparably superior. And so the conclusion that Pieper makes is that if the someone we believe in, Christ, God, exists who is incomparably superior to a mature person, then even a parent is superior to a child. And if this someone speaks to us, then that kind of radical faith is reasonable. Logic would actually demand that we grant total assent to the truth spoken by this someone. We're compelled by faith with a certitude that is superior to knowledge. And of course, that's what we profess in the creed. And that's what Saint Montfort was talking about with the total consecration to Mary. That's what Mary had, was blind obedience. So it doesn't mean that Mary was just unreasonably having blind obedience. It doesn't mean that her faith was blind. It means that she was compelled by faith to this someone who spoke to her, who she gave birth to, her Redeemer, her Creator, and her Son. And she was compelled by faith to believe. And so that's the radical blind obedience. It's not the same kind of blind obedience if I went to my hairdresser and said, I trust you to do whatever you want with my hair. I'll go whatever you say. It's not that same kind of blind obedience. It's not the same as if my husband came home and said, we're going to do whatever the government tells us to do from now on. We're not going to use our brains anymore. We're not going to think for ourselves. We're just going to go along blindly. It's not like that. It's this very narrow definition of this faith in God that we are compelled to, and Mary most of all was compelled to. And I find that really beautiful to think about as we are in Advent, as we're thinking about the birth of Christ, the nativity of Christ, and what it must, I think a lot, I know everybody does, think a lot about what it must have been like to be Mary. I have a 14-year-old daughter now. I have 4 teenage daughters right now, and the youngest of them is 14. So, and I have an older daughter too. So this is the 5th time I've had a 14-year-old daughter in my house. And I think a lot about what it was like for Mary, for the things that she was facing and the kind of radical faith that she has. And I'm reminded of my total consecration to Christ through Mary, how I've given everything everything. My kids, I think that was the hardest thing to let go of, because I want them to do exactly everything virtuously instead of finding their own way. My grandkids, the children we lost in miscarriage, my grandson who was born prematurely and died in October of this year. Even my talents, my thoughts, studying systematic theology now systematic philosophy after studying theology and chemistry, and just everything I do, every day that I wake up, every day that I have, every gift, giving it to Christ through Mary with the same kind of blind obedience. And I think at this point in my life, in my 50s now, I understand. I only am just now able to understand that kind of blind obedience, where I honestly do. And I'm only saying this because I know that there are people here who get it and who live the same way. All right, God, what do you have for me today? That's kind of how I get up every day, because I don't know what's going to happen most days with 9 grandchildren and 7 children, and more people who look to me to, because I'm getting older, I guess I'm getting wiser, look to me for advice. And lots of friends of our kids come around now. So, and lots of students from the past. But every day it's kind of crazy too, because I don't really know what's going to happen. I don't know whose stage I'm going to be a player on for that day. And I don't know how my life is going to intersect with other people's lives. And so I think if I were trying to control everything that happened in my life, that would be the most unreasonable thing now. I think the blind obedience like Mary had is the most reasonable way to go through life, when you're saying every day to God, God, grant me the grace to do your will today. So I hope that is additive, and that you find that enriching spiritually in this Advent time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Trasancos. And now we will entertain questions from our participants. The iTest Administrative Assistant, Sheila Roth, will moderate the Q&A. Sheila, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you, Dr. Verschuuren, and thank you, Dr. Trasancos. Beautiful presentations. Our first question is directed to Gerard, Dr. Verschuuren. If thinking is so important in faith, as you suggest, how can we deal with miracles that are also important in faith?
Yeah, that is a great question. The miracles are probably a stumbling block for a lot of people. They say, how can that be? We have miracles all over the place in the Bible. We have the miracle of the incarnation of Jesus, the birth from the Virgin Mary, the resurrection from the dead, and Jesus' ascension into heaven. Those are miracles, and we find them in the lives of many saints. Almost every day we celebrate another saint in the liturgy, in the Eucharist. So how is that possible? Well, I think the problem was caused by the famous skeptic philosopher David Hume. He said a miracle is a transgression of a law of nature. And he thought that was the end of miracles. I have my doubts. Miracles are definitely true, I would say. Basically, Dr. Stacy talked about all kinds of miracles in her experience and in her faith. So how do we deal with that? Well, laws of nature always have a separate clause, all things being equal clause. If the law of nature states what happens, it happens only if all those other variables are kept the same. That is the ceteris paribus clause. For instance, the law of gravity makes things fall to the ground. Yes, unless we catch them. And I always wonder when I see an ant crawling on the ceiling, I think, how are they defying the law of gravity? Is that a miracle? Not really. They implement conditions to work against the law of gravity. So once you accept that, and I think you have to, for laws of nature don't just work in the open space, they are surrounded by all kinds of conditions. If that is true and natural factors play a role, why can't we include supernatural factors, such as God's interference, God's providence? People who reject supernatural factors, they have nothing to base that on. We cannot test that in the laboratory. But we have to just accept the idea that there are also supernatural causes. People who deny that, they are basically taking on the assumption ahead of time, like David Hume did, that there are no supernatural causes. Well, that is begging the question, since the existence of supernatural factors is the very question at issue. They are reasoning in a circle. And as Pope Benedict XVI always said, if God is really God, then he's also in power of this world. And he can change things in this world because he is the, let's call it technically, the supernatural factor that makes things happen on earth. That's how he could resurrect Jesus. That's how he could, and by the way, I was thinking when Dr. Stacy was talking about all kind of witnesses, don't we have all the witnesses from people who said that Jesus appeared to them? And the way they describe it is, you could not come up with that on your own, I would say. Anyway, that's just a short point. I hope that's an answer to the question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Verschuuren. And then we have another question here. This is for Dr. Trasancos. The Catechism says in number 156 that faith is by no means a blind impulse of the mind. Yet we were talking about Mary having blind faith. How is that?
Good question. It's one of those things when I'm talking about, I get stumped and I think, wait a minute, is that quite right? And the Catechism does have, it's really close to each other. On paragraph 148, towards the beginning of the Catechism, it says, Mary, blessed is she who believed. And the Catechism talks about her. It says the Virgin Mary most perfectly embodies the obedience of faith. That's in the Catechism. It talks about, but by faith Mary welcomes the tidings and promise brought by the angel Gabriel, believing that with God nothing will be impossible, and so giving her assent, behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord, let it be done to me according to your word. And throughout her life until her last ordeal, when Jesus, her son, died on the cross, her faith never wavered, is what the Catechism says. She never ceased to believe in the fulfillment of God's word, and so the Church venerates Mary as the purest realization of faith. And then 2 pages over on section 156, it says what you just quoted. There are motives of credibility which show that the assent of faith is by no means a blind impulse of the mind. So how do you reconcile those two things? I think I covered it. We have to first get our head around why it's reasonable to believe in God. We can't go through life just believing everything we hear from everybody who tells us something. We have to decide why it is absolutely the most reasonable thing in the world to believe what God told us, especially when Jesus said, "This is my body." The end. That was, I've talked about this before to this group, like accepting the truth of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. It does come down to your yes. You do have to, at some point, let go of trying to understand everything, because you're never going to understand the mysteries of faith totally. You're never going to understand God fully. You have to let go of trying to understand everything like they teach us to do in school to get that one right answer. And you have to get comfortable with living with mystery, diving in and learning more. You can't just say it's a mystery, I'll never know everything. You have to say, I'm going to learn more and more and more. And that's the beautiful thing about it. I am a learner. I have to be learning things, or I'm not being Stacy. And so there's so much you can learn. You'll never learn it all in a lifetime. So it was reasonable that she had the faith. And that was not a blind impulse of the mind. But once having it and established that, then she walked in blind obedience.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Verschuuren, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I think Dr. Stacy explained that very well. maybe I should stress that she was talking most of the time about blind obedience and not just blind faith. Faith itself should not be blind, and she gave enough indications that that is the case. And once you have faith in someone, and that can be the person you are married to, or that can be Jesus, or that can be God, then you follow that with blind obedience. So that is what Mary did after the Annunciation. Nothing will be impossible with God, she said. That is her faith. That is not blind faith. That is faith that is based on her experience with Jesus and with God. And then she said, I let it be done to me according to your word. For I know who you are. I know that you are. Even in the book of Job, it is always, I know who you are. And at the end of the book of Job, I don't know any numbers on the top of my head, it says, you have convinced me, God, that all that happened in my life, that was horrible, I know you are love, you are good, you are doing that to protect me. And then God says, where were you when I made this world? He's not putting Job down. He's saying, do you realize I created you? That is love. And from that love, you can be in blind obedience that what happened to you in your life will be also coming from God and will actually just be your blessing. That's all I have to say to that question, I think.
Very good. Thank you very much. And we don't have any more questions posed. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Sebastian Mahfoud to finish up the webinar.
All right. So thank you very much, Sheila, for moderating the Q&A and for the responses by Dr. Verschuuren and Dr. Trasancos to the questions that were posed. For those who participated in this webinar, we thank you for your attention and for your interest in the work that's being done here, the work that helps us understand what it is that is a faith that makes us think. In conclusion, Sister Christina Siratinsky will offer our closing prayer. Sister Christina belongs to the Congregation of the Sisters Servants of Mary Immaculate, and she is currently Provincial Superior of the community situated in Toronto, Canada. Sister Christina, please lead us in a closing prayer.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. I thank you for this presentation for everyone. It was very faith enhancing. Oh Christ, you lived among people, worked and suffered together with them. The truth of life is not a matter of self-perfection nor a lonely road to personal salvation, but a headlong plunge into the turmoil of complex reality. No amount of love will ever do away with the pains of rebuke, frustration, ingratitude, misunderstanding, malice. But the difference is that with love in our hearts, these miseries will no longer be overwhelming. We will have learned to swim in the moving, salty, treacherous sea of humanity and to love it in spite of everything. And if we ever do come to perfect wisdom, we will love because of everything. For we will be able to see the striving behind the sin. We will love because frustrated hope behind despair, failures of love behind acts of malice, and infinite mercy covering them all. Lord, you are eternal, therefore you deserve eternal service. How fortunate is to serve you. For to serve you is to reign, not only in this life, but for eternity. Amen.